All right, in this video, we'll talk about the replication crisis in psychology, although I don't love that terminology, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. But I think it's important to discuss this topic in general, as well as the concept of objectivity in science. I think that no one individual can ever truly be 100% objective, but together, working collectively, we can check each other's work and generate more objective knowledge. If one person says something is true, I think we should approach that with a healthy skepticism, even if some or many people say that it's true. But if we all think the same thing based on the same evidence, I think that is approaching more of what we would consider objective truths in reality. And replication in science is a big part of that. Replication is a process of repeating studies in an attempt to reproduce the results. In other words, if a research team somewhere else discovers something and they say, here's my methods, here's my analytic approach, here are the statistical analyses that I ran, I should be able to run the same experiment and conduct the same analyses and reproduce the results of that experiment. If I can't, then we have a problem. Now, there are two types of replication. One is an exact or direct replication, in which I literally try to repeat exactly what the other researchers did. Then we have conceptual replications, which are not using the exact same methods, but trying to address similar research questions. So if someone is interested in studying, let's say, the effect of social media use on relationship quality, they might measure social media use by asking people how they feel about their social media use, whereas I might use a different measure, like having an app on their phone track exactly how many hours and minutes they use social media. That would be an example of a conceptual replication, since we're not using the exact same methods, but we're trying to see if we can reproduce the finding on a conceptual level. I want to discuss a famous paper that was published in 2015 that is discussed at some length in your textbook chapter on this topic. This was the paper published in the journal Science by the Open Science Collaboration, abbreviated here OSC. I bring this up because this was a very influential study, and also because I personally was a part of it. I was one of the researchers who conducted one of the 100 replication studies that were published in this paper. And the upshot for this paper is that more than half of the experiments that we tried to replicate could not be replicated. In other words, out of the 100 studies, more than 50 of them, we could not reproduce the results that the original study authors had written. And so that illustrates essentially a big problem in the field. If so many of the studies we publish cannot be replicated, some people would call this a crisis that potentially threatens the credibility of the field. Now, I do want to talk a little bit more here about the nature of replication. In a sense, this centers on statistical effects. So often what we would consider a failed replication is if there was a statistically significant result that was reported in the original study, but the replicators cannot reproduce that. In other words, we have a null finding. Sometimes it would be the other way around, where there's a null effect in the original study and a significant effect in the replication attempt, but that's much less common. And the reason why we would care about a significant result in the original, but a null result in the replication is because we care about false positives. And if the original study had a false positive, that's worrying. I want to talk about what a failed replication actually means. And I'm going to give an example here from a study that was published in the 1980s that illustrates the contrast effect, and the replication attempt published in 2017 by one of my friends and former lab mates, Rhonda Balzerini. Now, the contrast effect is essentially what happens when people look at photos or images of people who are very attractive, and then they view their own current romantic partners, either, boyfriends, girlfriends, spouses, etc., as less attractive by comparison. So in this study, psychologists recruited a sample of people in committed and heterosexual relationships. Some were randomly assigned to a condition where they saw photos of models who were either Playgirl or Playboy models, while others were assigned to a control group. And then they were asked to rate the attractiveness of their own romantic partners. Those who just saw the erotic images of physically attractive people who weren't their partner then rated their partners as less attractive compared to the control group. In the replication study, they ran basically the same study, thinking that they would find evidence for the contrast effect, but they did not. And they also tested not just how attractive do you think your partner is, but also how much love you feel, how much commitment, and how much support for the relationship you have. And none of those were statistically significant across the board. So now we're left with another type of question, which is, what do we make of this? Is it the case that the original study gave us a false positive and there is no evidence subjectively for the contrast effect? Some would say yes. Some would say the original study was wrong. I think we can approach this with a bit more nuance. It could be possible that in the 1980s, there was a thing that existed that we called the contrast effect, and now that no longer exists. Or it could be that the images in these magazines elicited a kind of psychological effect that we simply don't get anymore now because of the way that our attitudes towards sex have changed over the past few decades, or maybe the nature of erotic or pornographic images has changed. But overall, I think there's room for us to explore alternative possibilities. So one possibility is that the original result is correct and the replication effect is wrong. Second possibility is that the replication study result is correct and the original one was wrong. Another possibility is that both results are correct. And this is something that did exist in the 1980s, but no longer exists now, or perhaps some other combination, like both are incorrect. The first one was a false positive and the second one was a false negative. I think that one is the least likely, but is possible. And I would invite you in this case to think to yourself, what do you think is the most likely explanation? Now, if you're wondering why a study might not replicate, like what are the reasons for non-replication? One is obvious, and that's falsified data, fraud, basically. If the researchers in the original study paper faked their data, then obviously we wouldn't be able to replicate it because it was fraudulent. Another reason is that the original study sometimes includes a sample size that is just too small. In fact, this used to be a really, really big problem in studies from prior decades, where researchers would have sample sizes around 30, maybe 40 participants, which is really, really small. And with small sample sizes, we run the risk of statistical errors. I want to talk a little bit more about sample size on the next slide, but for now, that's kind of all you need to know. And replication studies typically have sample sizes that are much, much larger. Another explanation is that there's some culturally or generationally specific thing that explains why the original researchers got an effect. And it simply is just not the case anymore. We don't have that in our society, or we don't have evidence for it now. And that's why the result doesn't replicate, because times have changed, people have changed, cultures change, and there's just nothing we can do about it. And then the last idea here is poor replication quality. So this is when the people trying to replicate the original study don't do a very good job of it. Sometimes they don't communicate directly with the original study authors, or they use sloppy methods. Now, I want to give you a little bit more insight into how to be a stats sleuth. And this is based on some stuff that I've learned from scholars like Joe Simmons and others who have tried to point out ways in which researchers have been using bad methodology. And one of the things that researchers in this area have suggested is that if there is a gigantic effect size for a surprising result, we should be a little bit skeptical. The small telescopes analogy for replications, I think, is interesting because it basically is an analogy between physical sciences and social sciences. Let's say you take a telescope out at night and you look up in the sky with the telescope and you see a star or a constellation or something in the sky. The next night, if you come out with a larger and even more powerful telescope, you should definitely be able to see the thing in the sky that you saw the previous night, because the telescope you're using now is even more powerful than the smaller telescope that you used before. Sample size is kind of like that. If we get a statistically significant effect with 30 participants, and then we run a replication study with 300 participants, which is 10 times the sample size from the original study, we should definitely be able to see the same effect that the original research team saw. If we can't, with a much larger sample size, then we think there's, more likely a problem here, more likely that original was a false positive. Another thing that you can look out for is inconsistent statistical decisions across studies. For example, some researchers in one study might control for demographics like age or gender, and in study 1, but not do it again in study 2. Inconsistent statistical decisions across studies is a red flag and sometimes is signs that the researchers were p-hacking, and that's why there's a false positive. Another thing you can look for is whether the results are too perfect. For example, if all of the predictions work out exactly as planned and all of the hypotheses are supported. And this is unlikely to happen in every scientific paper. Sometimes we publish studies where some of our predictions panned out, but not all of them. In real life, in the world, science is messy, and scientific results are sometimes not going to work out exactly the way that you'd hoped or planned. Finally, the last and perhaps most important thing you can look for is whether the study authors are quote unquote open. The open science movement has really taken off in the past decade and is promoting the idea that scientists should be open about what they did in their studies and not keep their methods and procedures a secret. So, for example, the researchers could publicly share the materials and methods that they used, as well as their data files. Now, this is not always possible. If the data files contain sensitive information about participants, we may not want that to be open to the public. Maybe it could be shared across research teams in some limited circumstances. But most of the time, de-identified data sets can be shared. In addition, we can look at whether independent research teams can reproduce the findings. Now, in this case, I'm not talking about replication. I'm talking about taking the actual data file and giving it to other researchers to see if they can run the same results using their software. There have been a couple of high-profile studies I've seen where a research team gave the same data set to a bunch of different researchers, and a lot of the researchers couldn't get the same findings out of the same data set, which is worrying. So we would want to know, can other researchers actually reproduce the findings in your data set? And then finally, here on this slide, we want to know, was the study pre-registered? Pre-registration is a new procedure that researchers in psychology and other fields use to basically make public what they plan to do before they do it. And this is to differentiate exploratory from confirmatory analyses. In other words, the researchers should say ahead of time, we plan to test a correlation between these variables X and Y, or we plan to run this experiment where we use this manipulation and then use this other statistical test. And that way we hold ourselves accountable. If we don't do that, then we run the risk again of false positives. Another thing to keep in mind is that the publication and peer review system may be responsible for some of these failed replications. The peer review system often incentivizes scientists to come up with positive results. If scientists cut corners and do questionable research practices in order to achieve positive results so that they'll get published, because then they'll get grants and they'll get tenure and they'll get increases in salary, etc. That's not really good. We're kind of creating a system of perverse incentives. And so some researchers suggest we should publish fewer papers and change the incentive structure to focus on quality rather than quantity. Now, I want to end on a positive note because, as I said, I don't like the idea that this is a replication crisis. I think there are problems associated with failures to replicate studies in psychology, but I think if anything, this shows how much we're improving. We're doing much better science now than we were 10 or 15 years ago. I like this meme with Drake here, and instead of thinking about it as a replication crisis, we could think about it as a credibility revolution, that we're adopting new and better scientific methods to increase the rate at which our findings replicate and to increase the credibility of our scientific field.